Thanks very much to all of my friends at Nest and in the UK for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference today and for our ongoing collaborations, which do go back 15 years. So I want to talk today about how this literature on behavior change and defaults being one example is evolving and what we're learning as we keep gathering more data. I'm going to title the talk, Nudges Are Not Enough, and actually end up arguing that the reason Nest is so successful is that it incorporates both nudges and some clearly paternalistic elements that are not just nudge-like, that actually involve real economic incentives and hard constraints, and I'll come to that by the end. So here are the claims I want to illustrate with three examples. First, nudges tend to have clear short-run proximate effects. Not always, but in most cases, the nudge generates the short-run effect that it's trying to achieve. Second, nudges tend to have smaller long-run effects. The effects kind of fade away, not completely, but partially over the long run. Third, there tend to be some countervailing distal effects. So if you push this way, the pendulum does swing that way, but it tends to swing back, and in some cases even swings in the opposite way, and we'll see some examples of that. Fourth, and I want to really emphasize this, despite a lot of kind of negative elements along the way, I very much agree that we should keep using nudges. They're great, they're cost effective, they tend to be embraced by the public, they have so many pluses. But ultimately, I want to argue that they're not going to get the job done on their own. They're a great piece of a larger portfolio. And that extra piece that I'm going to talk about today is hard paternalism. So I'll emphasize ways in which sometimes we need to take a nudge and combine it with something like an economic incentive or illiquidity or a mandatory minimum, all elements of Nest that are key features that make Nest so successful. Okay, so the three examples I want to talk about, and there'll be questions at the end, so I hope you'll generate some questions as we go. I want to talk about a study that I did with Neil Stewart and colleagues at the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority here in the UK. I want to talk about a peer norming paper, and I want to talk about retirement savings. So first, the minimum payment study. This is joint work with Adams, Gutman, Keeney, Lucy Hayes, who may be here today, Stephen Hunt, and Neil Stewart, who is here today. And what we were trying to do is get people to pay more of their credit card debt back in a timely manner. And this debt reduction nudge did have its intended effect. And we'll see enormous proximate effects from this intervention, but we'll see lots of countervailing effects that are very interesting. Indeed, the nudge worked so well that one of the partners in this study dropped out within a couple weeks of the start of the study and didn't let us go through the whole year of analysis because the study was working so well at driving what they thought driving down debt in their credit card business. But these unintended distal effects ended up being highly countervailing. And by the end of the study, when we looked at the data 12 months in, we could see that this particular intervention, while it had powerful proximate short-run effects, had no net long-run effects in this domain. So here are the details. Again, this research is led by the FCA. It follows the great idea of actually trying out a policy before you make it the law of the land, getting some evidence before you proceed with legislation. We pre-registered the study to address issues of multiple testing and p-hacking. And we did a randomized field experiment in the domain of credit card repayment. And our goal, again, was to try to get people to carry less credit card debt and pay back their credit card debt in a more timely manner. Now, the critical element in this study is getting people to not sign up for automatic minimum payments on their monthly credit card. And the minimum payment in this context are the fees you owe in that month, the interest you owe in that month, so that's 1/12 of your annual interest rate, and then 1% of the balance. That's the minimum fee that we're trying to get people to not set up as their automatic payment. So our idea was to shroud the minimum fee when people came to the automatic payment page on this credit card company's web provider environment. So we wanted them to not see the automatic payment as a minimum as the option. And we wanted them to instead focus on other automatic payments, like paying automatically in full, or paying automatically some fixed payment that would presumably be greater than the minimum payment. So here's the control arm in our study, and you can see here there are 3 different options available to the individuals at this credit card company, the customers at this credit card company. They could either set up an automatic minimum payment, that's on the left. They could set up an automatic full payment, that's in the middle, or they could set up an automatic fixed payment, like £200 every month. Now our intervention is to eliminate the automatic minimum payment as one of the options that they see on this screen, and to leave them with, on this first screen, just the other 2 options. And we achieve that by simply moving the other 2 options to the left and taking the automatic minimum payment out of view. Now they could still set it up through some other channel, but it wasn't there right away salient on this first web page. We're studying 40,000 UK credit cards that were newly issued, and we're studying the people who came to set up an automatic minimum payment. And we want to see what will happen in our treatment group when we eliminate the automatic minimum payment from that first web page that they see. And we saw enormous proximate success. So this is another one of those nudges that night and day changes behavior. I want to blow up the key numbers you should focus on. So what fraction of people in our control group set up an automatic minimum payment? 37%. When we took the automatic minimum payment off of that first web page, now only 9.6% of the people coming to these web pages to set up automatic payments are now setting up the automatic minimum payment. So we take 37% with an automatic minimum and drive it down to only 9.6%, making an automatic minimum payment. Terrific success. Now that was the company that stayed in the study. The other company that left the study at this stage had an even more dramatic success. They went from 53% making automatic minimum payments in the control group to only 6.8% making automatic minimum payments in the treatment group. So we see for the company that ran away even bigger initial effects that scared this company out of the study. They were worried that we were going to really, I presume, decimate their business model. Now, if we think about this effect over time, we see the effect get smaller with each passing month. So that's part of what happens in the long run. Things tend to fade. What I'm plotting here on the horizontal axis is the statement cycle. Those are months. And on the vertical axis, we're plotting the change in the fraction of people making a minimum payment at the company that stayed in the study. And you can see this 25 percentage point reduction in the fraction of people making a minimum payment. This huge reduction. Now, of course, if they're not making an automatic minimum payment, what are they doing? They're making, many of them, automatic fixed payments. And so we see here a large increase in the fraction of customers making an automatic fixed payment, an approximate 20% increase, which again fades in the fraction of customers making an automatic fixed payment, say 50 or 100 pounds. Now, another effect is some people said, hey, I'm going to make an automatic full payment, and we also see that increase. So relative to the control group, the fraction of people making an automatic fixed payment goes up about 1 or 2 percentage points. A small effect, but still an effect in the quote-unquote good direction. More people paying their bill in full. So these are the this is the increase in the fraction of customers making an automatic full payment as a consequence of this randomized field experiment. So those are all the good pieces of news. Let's now think about some of the ways in which this didn't work as we intended. So less people set up any automatic payment as a consequence of us removing automatic payments from that initial web page. We see about a 5 percentage point decrease in the fraction of customers setting up any automatic payment. And since we think automatic payments are good because they facilitate not facing fees for missing a payment, this is one of those things that we regret and view as a kind of countervailing force. Now, another important mechanism that's at play here is though we got people to stop making automatic minimum payments and we got them to set up a lot of automatic fixed payments, the automatic fixed payments they tended to set up were pretty modest, in the range of 50 to 100 pounds. But if you're carrying a balance of 2,000 pounds and you've got to pay your interest that month and 1% of the balance that month, then setting up an automatic fixed payment of 50 pounds is irrelevant, because that's indeed less than or equal to the the minimum payment that you're due to pay that month anyway. So we got people to set up automatic fixed payments, but they tended to be small, so small that many of the minimum payments that were due anyway in later cycles exceeded the automatic fixed payment that people set up. So our automatic fixed payments ended up not having that much effect because they were just not big enough to actually matter. So we see here an example. If you have a $2,000 balance and you set up a 50-pound automatic fixed payment, it doesn't matter because your required minimum is equal to your automatic fixed payment anyway. So if we ask, how do we affect the fraction of people in the study making a minimum payment, once we take into account that their automatic fixed payments were pretty modest, we end up seeing relatively modest effects on behavior because their automatic fixed payments just weren't big enough to, in many cases, exceed the required minimum payment. And so if we look here, we see that we're not getting the 25 percentage point reduction in minimum payments that I showed you before. We're only getting about a 7 percentage point reduction in the fraction of minimum payments because so many of those automatic fixed payments were just small in size and did not exceed the required minimum payment. And so, relative to the enormous effects that you saw earlier, once we take into account the modesty of these automatic fixed payments, we're getting pretty modest effects from this intervention. So if we look at what really matters, the amount of debt being carried by these customers, we see that there's actually no change in total debt as a consequence of the intervention that we're studying. In this data, we see that the standard errors are big enough so that we can say nothing about there actually being a reduction in total debt. Moreover, there's yet one more mechanism that I want to highlight before concluding this particular study, this example. It looks like as a consequence of taking the automatic minimum payment off of that initial web page, while we did tend to increase the value of automatic payments, we tended to decrease the value of manual payments, which is the middle bar here. And so when you think about net payments, summing up both the automatic payments on the far left, the manual payments in the middle, and then we get to the total payments on the right, total payments tend to be essentially unchanged by our intervention. So in this particular study, there were 3 countervailing effects that offset that spectacular immediate proximate effect. These 3 distal effects, these 3 offsetting effects, ended up undoing this seeming success. What are they? Well, the intervention reduced the fraction of people who set up auto payments in the first place. The intervention tended to produce a lot of automatic small fixed payments, so small they did not exceed the required minimum. And then finally, people in the control group, people in the treatment group rather, tended to make fewer manual payments. And when you add up all of these effects, you end up getting an intervention that looked successful, but was indeed a wash because of all these distal and subtle long-run offsets. So that's the first example. An instance where we see a nudge not working as intended because the distal effects provide enough offset to completely undo the effect of the nudge. Here's another example, peer norming. We talk a lot about how people are so influenced by their peers, and we thought maybe we could use peer norming to drive up savings. So this is another randomized control trial. What did we do? This is joint work with John Beshears, James Choi, Bridget Madrian, and Katie Milkman. What did we do? We showed people what their peers were doing at a firm where almost everyone was saving in the retirement plan. And we showed this wonderful peer behavior to people who were not saving. And we said, look, your peers are saving, why don't you think about it? And we were able to vary whether people saw their peer information or not, and what kind of peer information they saw, whether they saw 85% of people in their 30s save or 80% of people in their 20s save. So we had all different sources of variation that we were studying. And we thought that by telling people how well their peers were doing, we would see spectacular effects. We ended up seeing absolutely no effects on average. There was a small perverse effect for unionized workers. We probably slightly drove down their savings rate. They were reactive and said, why are you doing this to me? Making me feel bad. And maybe a small positive effect for the non-unionized workforce. But net, really nothing was happening here. And we were able to exploit all these different types of exogenous variation, of random variation, all these different natural experiments, and they all generated the same conclusion that this peer norming nudge was not changing the behavior of savers at this company or of non-savers at this company. Third example, the one that probably is nearest and dearest to all of our hearts here today, retirement savings, especially in the realm of default retirement savings. So, as we all know, defaults have been enormously successful in driving participation in retirement savings schemes. So typically, when you introduce a default into a retirement savings scheme, whether it's in the UK or in the US, you drive participation in the first year of tenure up from about 40% to about 90%. And that's the immediate, proximate, great success that I think drives a lot of pension policy around the world today. The average savings rate, including the people who are not participating, goes up from about 1% to about 2% of people's income. So when I say it goes up, I mean from whatever baseline existed before you introduce auto-enrollment, you get an increase in the savings rate of about 1 or 2 percentage points. So that's the good news. That's the headline that motivated legislation in the US, NEST in the UK, auto-enrollment adopted around the world. Now, the long-run effects are a little murkier. Households that do not see automatic enrollment don't just sit there passively and stay out of their savings scheme for all time. They do tend to enroll. It just takes them much longer to enroll. So if we go past the first year and start talking about years 2, 3, 4, 5, we see that under auto-enrollment, you go from a 90% enrollment rate at the end of year 1 to a 95% enrollment rate 3 years later. Whereas if you don't have auto-enrollment, you see much more growth in enrollment because you have much more to catch up to. So you see from year 1 to 3 years later, year 4, the enrollment rate goes from about 40% to about 70%. So with auto-enrollment, you start high and stay high, and without auto-enrollment, you're on this catch-up trajectory. Now, you don't catch up. Auto-enrollment remains ahead, so auto-enrollment wins the race, but the huge gaps that we see at the end of year 1 are shrinking over time. Now, there's another issue that kind of undermines all of these arguments about the benefits of nudging people into saving, which is that in the US, where we have the right to leak out of these accounts, there's enormous leakage out of retirement savings accounts. Approximately 40% of the dollars that flow into these accounts leak out before retirement. And here I'm not talking about rollovers to an IRA. I'm talking about distributions from the retirement savings system. 40 cents on the dollar is leaking out. And that leakage rate seems to be even a little bit higher for people who are auto-enrolled. So they're not so passive. They're actually happy to leak out. So we want to think about this 40% leakage rate in the US. Now, kudos to all of you, because in the UK, you don't allow leakage. And while there's pros and cons to that, on net, I think it's a great thing that the UK retirement savings system has the illiquidity feature that our theories tell us, and the data seems to support, are a good thing. By requiring the money to stay there until people either become disabled or old enough to retire, you're enabling those funds to stick. Whereas in the US, they're leaking out very rapidly, causing very diminished wealth formation by the time people reach retirement. Now, there's another mechanism like leakage, which is a crowd-out mechanism in savings. If I've got more and more wealth accumulating in my retirement savings account, I may feel wealthy, and I may feel less pressure to save in the future, or I may feel the ability to decumulate savings that I already have. And we're beginning to see these kinds of effects measured in data. There's a new paper by Chukman from 2019, and there's new work that I've done with John Beshears and James Choi and Bridget Madrian and Bill Skimmyhorn, where we're wondering whether we're actually seeing some debt crowd-in as a consequence of automatic enrollment. People who may be borrowing more, especially with respect to auto loans and mortgages, as a consequence of being auto-enrolled. Now, those effects are murky, and the sample sizes aren't big enough, even though we have 100,000 people in this data set. We don't know whether these effects are just noise or whether there's something real happening there. But these are questions that are now beginning to present themselves as we look at the data and begin to see these effects despite the very large standard errors in the analysis. So a successful retirement savings plan can't just rely on nudges, or really shouldn't just rely on nudges. Nudges are going to raise retirement savings. But a successful plan has to have some other elements that I see at Nest that make programs like Nest work better than their analog programs in the US. So what are the hard paternalism elements that exist here? Well, you have a mandatory minimum savings. And you have it, of course, both in your national pension, and you have it now in Nest with this 8% minimum. You also have illiquidity, which I mentioned before. It's critical that the money that goes into your pension pots stays there and can't come out. And when we look both at theory and we look at the data, we see good reasons for wanting that money to be locked up and not susceptible to spend down in the decades before retirement. And then finally, you have matching. And matching is not a nudge. Matching is an economic incentive. It's a hard incentive. It's a real incentive. And so I believe that your success, the success of Nest that I'm very impressed by, is not just coming from default enrollment, which I endorse. I love that. I'm glad you have it. But I think it's also coming from these other elements that joint with the nudge produce a combined effect that is very successful and I think going to dramatically improve retirement saving readiness in the long run in the UK. I think you're going to do better than we're going to do in the US because you're more prone to incorporate the nudge with the hard paternalism than we are in the US. So let me just summarize and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. I wanted to make 6 claims about nudges. First, nudges tend to have clear short-run proximate effects. They work in the short run in a big way. But the long-run effects tend to be a little bit weaker, and in some cases a lot weaker. And in many cases, there's actually countervailing distal effects. Not only do the effects weaken, but you have actual offsets. And those offsets can even be strong enough to completely undo the effect of the nudge. Nevertheless, I am completely in favor of using nudges in social policy. They're a good thing. They're highly cost-effective. But we shouldn't be under the illusion that a nudge alone can achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve with policy. Nudges should be part of a bigger portfolio of policy ingredients that jointly produce the outcome that we need. And though it's not something that everyone wants to hear, some of those policy ingredients need to be incentives and other types of hard paternalism, whether it be illiquidity, whether it be savings minimums, whether it be matching dollars. These additional elements play a critical role with nudges in making systems like Nest work so well. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to just eat slightly into the lunch break to make sure we have some time for people to ask David some questions. So I'm going to play the very important role of pointing at people for the microphone to go to. So let's throw it straight open to questions in the back here.
Hi, Jonathan Wildman from behaviour. The studies you've done here seem to be about, particularly on the retirement area, about the saving element. We have a problem at the moment that we've completely opened the door at the point that someone enters the retirement market in terms of what they buy and how they generate their income. Do we need some kind of nudge, which we're thinking about at the moment with default pathways, to help guide people in the right way in that area as well?
Yeah, so I would endorse nudging people when they reach retirement and have to decide what to do with their pension pot. And I might endorse something even stronger than a nudge. I might endorse some guide rails or guardrails that prevent them from being fully irresponsible. I think one thing that is a little encouraging in this regard is that the behavior of someone at age 30 may be different from the behavior at someone at age 70 in terms of things like impulsivity and self-control problems. So it is possible that we might want to put more guardrails in for people. I mean, certainly think about if any of you have a teenager in the house, you understand that teenagers are different from people in their 20s and people in their 30s and so on. We don't really know that much about when people transition to a place where we might want to give them maximal freedom. Maybe we never want to give them maximal freedom and require some minimum annuitization rate. I know you've moved away from that here. But I do think that we have this interesting consideration that self-control may become better as people move through the life course, until, of course, we reach the point of diminished cognitive capacity and things like dementia.
I think there's a question from Will and then from Steve. So Will first. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Will Price from D3P Global. I think I would be even more sort of sanguine about the chances of people getting better as they get older. So in Malaysia, is a good example, the Employees Provident Fund, amazing accumulation phase, 23% of income, half employer, half worker, great cultural norms on savings. People get decent balances, but you can take it all out as a lump sum. 2 surveys. One, 50% of people take it all in 5 years, and 70% of people take it all in 10 years. And it's, for me, the archetypal example, along with the fact that Australia is moving away from, or trying to move away from 100% lump sums, that all the arguments you've gone through are right, and they're right in the accumulation, and why should we expect them to not be right in the decumulation?
Yeah.
Okay. Steve? Just in the middle here.
David, how much do you think defaults are a political accommodation rather than an economic one, in the sense that the UK could have chosen, we were just mentioning the Australian path, which is clearly hard paternalism in terms of universal coverage, mandates, no illusions about matching contributions coming from the employer, right? How much is it really, both for the US but also in the case of the UK, really a political accommodation that people want to believe that they have freedom when in fact they're being mandated?
Yeah, I completely agree. Nudges have many favorable properties, and high on that list is their political palatability. And we need to be cognizant that we can't just have the policies that an egghead wants. We need to have the policies that our democracies want. And nudges are far more popular than paternalistic policies. But I think as thought leaders, we need to be aware of the reality that nudges on their own are not going to generate the retirement savings adequacy that we think we need. And however we introduce those other incentives, let's not call them paternalistic policies, incentives, that's a much more favorable word, but of course it is paternalism. We have to find a way to bring that into the conversation. And I think, I love, when Nest talks about things, maybe I'm outing Nest here, which I don't mean to do, but the word paternalism doesn't enter the conversation when we talk about mandatory minimums, when we talk about employer matching, when we talk about the illiquidity in the system which predates Nest, of course. Those are policies that have existed long before Nest existed. But those are all the paternalistic elements that do need to coexist if this is going to work, and maybe we need to avoid words like paternalism because they're so offensive and focus on words like defaults because they're so appealing. But I think we should be aware of what we're doing.
Okay, so I think Heather and then Ida, and I think that probably will be all we have time for, I'm afraid. But
Thanks. Heather Kappis from the LSE. I guess this follows up on what you just said, but like you, I'm generally a fan of nudges, but some of the research that I've seen lately says one other unintended consequence is that voters and maybe policymakers who have a choice between a nudge and a more paternalistic solution, like with carbon offsets, for instance, will prefer the nudge, and that crowds out their support for doing something that will be more difficult, less palatable, but maybe more powerful. What else can we do when we communicate how nudges work but also aren't enough?
Well, I think we just need to turn a corner in the international conversation, because there's this vague impression out there that nudges are all powerful and that anything that we need to do can be done with a nudge. And I would be amazed if we could address the problem of climate change with nudges. And as an economist, I'll say another dirty word, carbon tax, a word that almost nobody in the world likes except economists. But I do think that we're going to need policies that are either equivalent to a carbon tax or indeed a carbon tax to address things like climate change, rather than all of the wonderful nudges that get people to reduce their carbon production by 1%. Those nudges work, they're cost effective, they do change carbon output, but the effects are too small for us to rely on them as the solution, and we need to communicate that to the world before we end up with this, I think, incorrect impression that nudges can do it on their own.
Okay, so we're going to take one last question from Ida.
Yeah, I think we're following on the same line here. I do wonder if the right frame is what is smart pension policy design, because I think a lot of this isn't just Nest. It's at the country level, potentially more and more at an international level. We have to be able to set the goal. What is it that society needs? What is it that people in society need to thrive, for the democracy to thrive, things like that. So this shift from where can we get with nudges to where do we get with smart policy design, or even just saying what the goal is and then having the conversation about what level of innovation, market innovation, can get us there, and what level of policy parameter has to set what's acceptable. I don't know how we all get there, but I feel like part of the crowd out conversation you're having is that we're actually afraid of naming the things that we need to achieve, and then be able to then assess how much of that can be useful nudges and how much of that needs to be leadership around policy.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, everyone, thank you, David.